Fox 8 News presents a special report, Weathering the Storm 2017, sponsored by Egan Insurance, Gulf State Toyota, Metropolitan Human Services District, and Fidelity Bank. Now, here is Fox 8 Chief Meteorologist David Bernard.
It's been 5 years since our last storm, and that was Hurricane Isaac. And it's been nearly a decade since we had our last evacuation with Hurricane Gustav. We've seen thousands of new people move to southeast Louisiana and the Gulf Coast since Katrina. So whether you're new or a native, we could all use a little hurricane checkup. Let's start with some meteorology and look at how conducive the atmosphere may be for storms this season. The forecast from NOAA is calling for 11 to 17 storms, 5 to 9 hurricanes, and possibly 2 to 4 major hurricanes. The long-term average, 12, 6, and 3. So the odds are, at least according to NOAA, this could be an above-average season. But does it matter? No, because every year we run the same risk of having a hurricane here in Louisiana, regardless of what those forecasts say. Now, here's some of the reasons why we might have a more active season. The El Nino might be non-existent or very weak. The wind shear might be below average as well. And right now, water temperatures across the tropical basin are running normal to even slightly above average. Now, if we do get an El Nino developing, typically that means lots of thunderstorms in the Pacific with rising air, but that leads to sinking air over the Caribbean. That sinking air makes it difficult for storms to form and grow into large hurricanes. But north of those winds lie the Gulf of Mexico, which typically are not affected by the El Nino. So even if one develops, we can still get a big storm in the Gulf. There's other factors to consider, like Saharan dust. In some years, lots of deep Saharan dust covers the Atlantic basin, and when that happens, the atmosphere is more stable, and that also makes it more difficult for storms to form. Remember, typically we start off slow, but as we go into August and September, that's usually when we're most active, and it's also when some of the most violent storms have tended to form. Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's been nearly a decade since our last mandatory evacuation inside the risk reduction system. We know there are thousands of residents who are not capable or have the means to simply drive away on their own. The city is constantly fine-tuning its plan for the next big storm. And as we learned from Bruce Katz, a key part of that effort involves evacueers.
These EvacuSpot sculptures scattered all across the city mark free pickup locations for those who don't have their own vehicles.
You can walk up to an EvacuSpot and receive assistance to evacuate from the city of New Orleans in the event that the mayor or the governor initiate a mandatory evacuation. They're open to the general population, there's no fee, and there are volunteers, which are crucial for our organization, to assist with the evacuation process.
An evacueer will meet you and sign you up as the first step to make sure you get to a safe place outside of New Orleans.
All persons with pets, please stay on the bus and depart at the pet registration area.
If you have a pet, it must be in a carrier or restrained on a leash, and it must have a collar and a tag.
In reality, it will be a very fast process. We will swipe your driver's license or identity card, scan your wristband, and get you into the line to get on a bus or on a plane.
But what about the many elderly or disabled who are unable to get to one of these 17 pickup points? That's where Special Needs Registry can literally be a lifesaver. City leaders urge those with disabilities to sign up now by simply calling 311. Don't wait until a storm is brewing in the Gulf, because when that happens, it can be difficult to reach the city's 311 center. So if you have a limited mobility or you know someone who cannot leave town without help, call 311 before we face a mandatory evacuation. That way the city can send a response team to safely and quickly transport the city's most vulnerable out of harm's way. For Weathering the Storm, I'm meteorologist Bruce Katz.
If you don't live in New Orleans, plans for assisted evacuation vary across the region. However, in most cases, you can pre-register, and you're urged to do so by contacting your local office of emergency management. Now I'd like to take a moment and talk about flood risk and insurance. 20%. That's the percentage of flood claims that comes from areas not considered high risk. Flooding is the #1 natural disaster in the United States. Many of us have recently seen reduced rates for our flood insurance because of the new FEMA flood maps. And some of us may not be required to carry flood insurance any longer by our lenders. But that is a huge mistake. 1/3 of all money paid by the National Flood Insurance Program are from these areas not considered high risk. All we have to do is look at the Baton Rouge and North Shore floods last year to understand that if you live in Louisiana, you can flood. By the time I reached high school, I was already in meteorology, but on the first day of high school in Houston, Texas, the principal came on the radio and said, "We're under a hurricane watch and we may have a storm in the next 24 hours. And indeed we did. Hurricane Alicia, a Category 3 storm, ended up knocking down trees all over my neighborhood, damaging houses. We even had a tornado. And that event certainly cemented in my mind that this is what I wanted to do for a profession.
Fox 8 News is helping you get ready for a new hurricane season with Weathering the Storm. Chief Meteorologist David Bernard will be back in a moment.
Hey everyone, I have a little tip for your hurricane supply kits this year. If you don't already have one, I highly suggest picking up a headlamp. It's basically a little flashlight that you can put on your head, allowing you to stay hands-free. This is great if you have to carry a kid around, or maybe you have to pick up and move things once the storm knocks out your power. It also allows you to stay hands-free in the event you trip over something and need to catch yourself, which is one of the easiest ways to hurt yourself after a storm. So I have this in my hurricane supply kit. I suggest you put it in yours too.
Welcome back. 51 people died, 12 in Louisiana, during a storm that few now remember. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the 1947 hurricane. The storm caused a whopping $100 million in damage. That would be tens of billions of dollars today. As meteorologist Nicandra Norwood reports, the storm led to the beginning of our modern-day levee protection.
A break in the 17th Street Canal.
The Corps of Engineers estimated that there was about 30 square miles of Metairie that was flooded.
Water in neighborhoods for weeks.
This also was one of the interesting storms because it showed the danger of Lake Pontchartrain.
Lake water flooded as many as 12,000 homes in Old Metairie. The Times-Picayune documents the extent of the flooding with rowboat rescues from the 200 block of Helios and the 500 block of Hesper, south of I-10 today. With more than 30 years of environmental reporting for NOLA.com Times-Picayune, Mark Shefstein knows how storms impact the region.
That was a direct hit over the city of New Orleans.
Laurelyn Wright lived through the 1947 hurricane at 13 in Bucktown.
It was a very rural place. We lived in a house on the 17th Street Canal.
The wind and rain was already coming down when the family headed to East End School.
And I cried because I was scared to death.
With good reason. A friend never made it to safety.
Eleanor was her name.
Her entire family died in the storm.
There was a big wave that, I guess like a tidal wave, because all the family they drowned.
She remembers the destruction the storm left behind.
All the houses that were, say, 3 blocks from the lake, they were all washed up into one pile, about 5 blocks way up in the woods.
Today we have this sophisticated hurricane risk reduction system with gates and locks, helping to keep the water out with these very high levees. In 1947, those didn't exist. It was a system of private levees across most of the area. Jefferson Parish actually didn't have a levee much higher than the height of Old Hammond Highway.
The Metairie levee was basically non-existent at the time.
A Category 2 at its St. Bernard Parish landfall with recorded winds of 110 miles per hour. It's one of the only storms to have an eye go directly over the metro area in recorded history. Moisant Field, now Armstrong International, suffered 2 feet of water on the runways. The anemometer broke after recording 90-mile-per-hour winds.
You started very, very quickly after that storm having levees under design and development for the Metairie lakefront.
Today, many thousands more are at risk.
The rarest events are the ones that cost the most money for us and could be a real problem both for us and for the nation.
A lesson to remember as we chronicle the trials and triumphs of natural disasters along the Gulf Coast. Nicandra Norwood, Fox 8 News.
The most likely inconvenience we face during and after a storm is loss of power and communications. Here are some additional tips you'll want to keep in mind. A generator is the surefire way to meet your power needs. But if you have one, by all means, know how to operate it safely and never run it inside your home, garage, or outside near windows and doors. LED technology is now making it easier to provide low levels of light for the entire house and family for up to a week with few, if any, additional batteries. Make sure everyone in the house has their own flashlights and lanterns. And inverters, that's another source to use inside your car to keep laptops, tablets, and phones charged. And finally, another way to conserve power is keeping those phones on airplane mode to preserve battery life. Batteries on phones and tablets are easily drained when not in use because of apps running in the background or in poor cell phone reception areas. Some phones even feature a low power mode if your phone is almost dead. And finally, here's kind of an old-fashioned tip. It's possible that communication within the storm zone could be severely damaged, making even text messaging unreliable. Keep a list of those important numbers with you and have a contact out of town who can communicate with other family members and your job about your whereabouts and status.
Well, I caught the weather bug early, and it had a lot to do with hurricane season. I remember that my Uncle Steve and my papa would sit me on their lap and let me help them push the pins into a hurricane tracking map that my mom actually hand cross-stitched herself. And I remember sitting there and them telling me where the hurricane had been and where it was going to go, or at least where they thought it was going to go. And that was kind of my first taste of forecasting for the tropics. But that's where it all started, and that's why I'm here today.
You're watching the Fox 8 News Special Report, Weathering the Storm 2017. More from Fox 8 Chief Meteorologist David Bernard right after this.
My go-to hurricane supplies are all about communications. You got to keep the cell phone going, and these little batteries are good to have anytime. You'll generally get about 2 charges out of them. Now, if the towers are down, that's not going to help you. An old-fashioned landline and a corded phone, they're your friend. Now remember, it can't be digital. Those will go out with the power as well. Now you want to keep in touch with Fox 8. You got the generator but no cable. An antenna is the way to go. This is going to get that signal nice and clear even on the big 60-inch HD. Plus, never fail, have that old-fashioned battery-operated radio. This could be your only source of communications.
We've learned that if you live in the hurricane zone, you definitely need elevation. But how your home is constructed, well, that's just as important. And as Shelby Latino reports, concrete could be another solution to help us weather the storm.
In the next year end to year after that, we project another 300 houses.
Builders along the Mississippi Gulf Coast are putting up more and more homes with concrete from top to bottom.
We have a fortified structure, and what that means is, like most other concrete methods, is that this structure can withstand really any wind load you put at it.
The roof, floors, and walls are all constructed with panels made from a company based in Long Beach called Gulf Concrete Technology. A polystyrene core is sandwiched between 2 layers of wire mesh and covered in mortar.
And this is a typical example of what we use to build a residential house structure.
Eventually, stucco will be added. From the outside, this will look like any other house. The difference will be a concrete frame versus wood. The technique has been used extensively in Florida for years, but it's still relatively new here. Besides offering protection from the force of a hurricane, the concrete structural components promote energy efficiency and reduce the risk of termite damage. Developers also say homeowners can expect a reduction in insurance rates. For Weathering the Storm, I'm meteorologist Shelby Latino.
So growing up in New Orleans, I guess one of the most memorable hurricane experience would have to be 1969 Hurricane Camille. I was 6 years old, first grade at Sandbar School. We had a 2-story home in Metairie, and Danny Abramowitz, the wide receiver for the Saints, they were concerned about flooding. So the Abramowitzes said, you know what, could we stay at your house in the event we had flooding? 2-story house, they'd be fine. They had a 1-story house, but the problem is, when we woke up the next morning, our house had no issue. But the Abramowitz house, they had broken windows and a tree went through it. So they got a taste of what South Louisiana storms can do.
Coming up, more of Weathering the Storm 2017 with Fox 8 Chief Meteorologist David Bernard.
When it comes to surviving the storm, power can be your best friend. Now, not all of us can have big, expensive generators, especially if you live in a small home or an apartment. So a portable power station can be your best friend. It has a couple of AC outlets on it, even a USB port, so you can charge your laptops and electronic devices on it. You can run a small fan all night long so you're not hot without the AC. It even has jumper cables for your car, and this particular model has an air compressor in case you get a flat tire. Power is your best friend and my favorite survival tip.
This hurricane season, we want to make sure that you're getting the best information straight from your weather authority. In addition to watching Fox 8, make sure that you download the Fox 8 weather app. Already have it? Great. Make sure it's updated and follow me. Open the app and go to the radar tab. Click the layers button. It looks like 3 stacked squares. Then you're going to want to make sure that the tropical tracks overlay is turned on. This will allow you to track the latest cone updates, satellite, and radar. Then turn on your tropical alerts. That will make sure that you get the latest updates about watches or warnings that are issued where you are, even if you're traveling. And there's no shortage of ways to stay up to date. From our Fox 8 apps to social media, Roku, Amazon, NewsOn, iHeartRadio, and streaming live on fox8live.com, we have you covered.
When a storm hits, there's a lot of preparation to do, but one of the most important things you need to think about is what about clean water? Well, if you don't want to go buying gallons and gallons of water, you can buy a portable 5-gallon bottle, and this will suffice for 5 gallons, and this will take care of a lot of things. Another thing is, what about filling your bathtub up with water? You may say, well, you know, the bathtub may not be clean. Well, now they've got a new product called the Water Bob. And this Water Bob will hold up to 100 gallons of water. And also, it's got a pump to it. You can fill up the 5-gallon, or you can fill up a pitcher. You can pump it out. And believe it or not, this will keep the water fresh for nearly a month.
Fox 8's Weathering the Storm with Chief Meteorologist David Bernard will continue in a moment.
When I think about my hurricane past, I always think about Hurricane Gilbert. I was in the 6th grade, and that was a huge storm. There'd been a tropical storm here the week before, but everybody was waiting for Gilbert. And I was bringing my hurricane tracking chart to school every day and giving the report from the morning news. So I think that was the storm that really let me know I wanted to study the weather. And it's always stuck out for me. The low pressure on that storm was 888. And that was a record in the Atlantic until Katrina came along. So as far as hurricanes go, that's the one that really nudged me into wanting to be a meteorologist.
2016 was a quiet year for Southeast Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, but it was a devastating year for the southeastern United States and the Caribbean. 2 storms were retired because of the impacts they made, Hurricanes Matthew and Otto. Matthew formed in the Caribbean in late September and by the 30th became the first Category 5 storm in the Atlantic Basin since Hurricane Felix back in 2007. Matthew caused catastrophic flooding in Haiti, killing hundreds of people. Millions lost homes or were in need of food and water following the storm. Flooding was also reported in the Dominican Republic and eastern Cuba, with some rainfall totals up to 2 feet. Matthew went on to cause extensive storm surge flooding in northeast Florida around Jacksonville, and torrential rains meant major flooding in the Carolinas. It was the first October hurricane to strike north of Florida since Hazel back in 1954. The other retired storm last year was Otto. Otto was the first storm since 1851 to hit Costa Rica, and it was the latest storm on record to form in the Caribbean. Otto hit the Nicaraguan-Costa Rican border on November 24th. At the time, it was a Category 3 hurricane. The storm was responsible for dozens of deaths and nearly $200 million in damage. This year's list of storms began with Arlene and ends with Whitney. But this year, there is one new name on the list. It's Irma, replacing Hurricane Irene that was retired back in 2011.
Living with hurricanes is a way of life in southeast Louisiana and along the Gulf Coast. And while first responders and government leaders will do their part, it's up to you and your family to take the action needed to prepare for the next storm. You can count on my experienced team of Fox 8 meteorologists to do our part to get you through any threat. And if a severe storm enters the Gulf of Mexico, we will also have hurricane consultant Bob Breck with his own insights and knowledge. For Nicandra, Bruce, and Shelby, I'm David Bernard. Thanks for watching.